This is the English opening, a flexible first move that controls the d5 square and prepares to develop pieces towards the center, without immediately committing to a pawn structure. This move prepares to control the center and develop pieces, often leading to transpositions into solid defenses like the French or Caro-Kann, depending on white's subsequent responses. Developing the knight to c3 supports a central pawn advance and prepares for queenside expansion, often leading to a queen's pawn game or English opening structure. This move establishes central pawn tension and opens lines for black's pieces, preparing to challenge white's space advantage and enter common openings like the queen's gambit. Declined. This move establishes a solid pawn center and initiates the queen's gambit. Declined. A classical and strategically rich opening, aiming to control central space. This move develops a piece and controls central squares, preparing to challenge white's d4 pawn and enter a queen's gambit. Declined structure. This move, 4, cx d5, is a common continuation in the queen's gambit. Declined, specifically transitioning into a variation of the exchange variation. White aims to simplify the position and achieve an often symmetrical pawn structure, which can lead to strategic maneuvering and potential endgame advantages by eliminating central tension. This recapture maintains black's central pawn presence and opens a diagonal for the queen, setting up development in the classical queen's gambit. Declined structure. This move develops a piece and pins black's knight, limiting its mobility and preparing to contest the center. This move develops the bishop, prepares to castle, and challenges white's influential bishop on g5, a common theme in queen's pawn openings like the Catalan or the queen's gambit. Declined. This move solidifies white's pawn center and prepares for kingside castling, aiming for a stable and harmonious development in the queen's gambit. Declined. Exchange variation. Black castles to safety, completing the king's side development and preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure. This move, bd3, aims to develop the bishop to a more active square, supporting a potential kingside attack and preparing to castle, while also keeping the pawn on e3 solid. This move develops the knight and prepares to support the central pawn push with c6 or e5, aiming for a solid pawn structure typical of queen's pawn openings. This developing move prepares to castle kingside, strengthens the center, and allows the queen to potentially activate along the d-file later. This move develops the rook to the central file, preparing to challenge white's control of the e-file and potentially support a pawn advance in the center. This move develops the queen to a more active square, supporting the central pawn and preparing for potential queenside expansion or castling on the queenside. This move solidifies the pawn center and prepares to reinforce the queenside with b5, creating a strong pawn structure against white's active pieces. This move, castling kingside, secures the king behind a protective pawn shield and brings the rook towards the center, actively participating in the game's development. This move is a common maneuver in queen's pawn structures aiming to reroute the knight to a more active square, likely e6 or g6, to support central control and potential kingside play. By exchanging the bishop for the knight, white resolves the tension in the center and creates doubled pawns for black, disrupting black's pawn structure and potentially weakening the e-file for future play. Black recaptures the bishop with their own bishop, solidifying the pawn chain in the center and preparing to challenge white's central control. This move initiates a queenside pawn expansion, aiming to gain space and potentially create weaknesses for black's king's side by opening lines or forcing unfavorable pawn moves. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing white's queenside pawn majority and preparing to challenge the bishop on d3. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to support a central pawn push or potentially maneuver to the kingside, while also reinforcing the d-pawn. This move develops the rook to its most active square, preparing to challenge white's control of the c-file and potentially pressure white's queenside pawn structure. This move aims to exchange white's light-squared bishop for black's knight, creating a slightly less active pawn structure for black on the queenside after a potential dxc6. Black exchanges a bishop for a knight, simplifying the position and removing white's active bishop from the critical kingside diagonal, aiming to ease the defensive pressure and potentially prepare for pawn breaks in the center. This capture removes black's active bishop and opens the f-file for potential queen activity, simplifying the position for white. This move is crucial for centralizing the queen and preparing to challenge white's dominant bishop pair by potentially rerouting the knight to a more active square. Exchanging queens simplifies the position, leading to a favorable endgame where white can utilize the open c-file and pressure black's queenside. This move initiates a pawn structure with symmetrical central pawns, aiming to simplify the position and utilize the open d-file for the knight. This move initiates a queenside expansion, aiming to create space and potentially open lines for the rook on the queenside, while also preventing black from consolidating their pieces effectively. The exchange of bishops has simplified the position, and white's move a4 aims to restrict black's queenside play by creating weaknesses on the b5 square. Black's b7 aims to reinforce the d6 pawn and prepare for potential queenside counterplay or to reroute the knight to a more active square. This move prepares to double the rooks on the b-file, aiming to exploit the semi-open file and generate pressure against black's queenside pawns. This move, nf6, is aimed at challenging white's strong central pawn and preparing to recapture on d5 if white exchanges, while also developing the knight to a more active square. This pawn push aims to gain queenside space and restrict black's knights, while potentially creating weaknesses on the c-file if black responds with c5. This move prepares to challenge white's queenside pawn expansion by preventing the b5 advance and potentially opening the a-file for black's rook. This knight maneuver prepares to redeploy to the c5 square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain control of central squares. The bishop retreats to f8 to defend the weak e7 square and to potentially support a future pawn push on the kingside, while the knight on a4 exerts pressure on the queenside. This move aims to reroute the knight to a more active central square, potentially creating pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and preparing for further pawn advances. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, supporting the knight on f6 and preparing to contest the e-file, potentially reinforcing the pawn structure or enabling a coordinated attack. This move prepares to activate the king by repositioning it to a more central and safer square, allowing for easier coordination with the remaining pieces and potential pawn advances. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially f6 or d6, to exert pressure on white's queenside pawn structure and support potential central breaks. The king steps forward to join the queenside play and potentially activate the central pawn majority after the opponent's knight retreats. This move repositions the knight from its passive square on d6 to a more active outpost on d6, aiming to control key central squares and potentially support a future kingside attack or exploit weaknesses in white's pawn structure. The king now moves towards the center to participate in the game. A necessary step in this endgame is centralizing the king is crucial for supporting pawn advances and controlling key squares. The rook's redeployment to the e-file prepares for potential exchanges and reinforces the center, aligning with white's knight on a4 and the pawn majority on the queenside. This move prepares to centralize the king by first reinforcing the e-file and then repositioning the king via the g1 square. This pawn move prepares to challenge white's control of the dark squares and potentially create an avenue for the king to become more active later in the game. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to support the knight on d6 and potentially contest the e-file or reinforce the kingside defense if black decides to advance on that side. This move prepares to challenge white's central pawn presence and potentially activate the kingside pawns for future attacking possibilities. This move centralizes the rook, preparing to contest the open e-file and potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside or defend the kingside pawn structure. The bishop retreats to the h6 square, maintaining its active diagonal influence and preparing to potentially trade off white's well-placed knight on circa 5, which currently restricts black's pieces. The knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to contest control of the d-file and potentially support a pawn advance on the queenside. The bishop retreats to f8 to defend the g6 pawn and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the kingside. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside by repositioning the knight, potentially aiming for a kingside attack or defending against any black advances. The bishop retreats to h6, aiming to reposition on a more active diagonal and potentially challenge white's queenside space advantage, while also guarding the f6 pawn. This move prepares to create a protected passed pawn on the queenside by potentially advancing the b-pawn, while also reinforcing the kingside structure against any potential breakthroughs by black's knights. The king repositions to a more active central square, potentially supporting pawn advances or creating a safer haven from any future attacking threats along the open files. This move g4 aims to create space on the kingside, potentially preparing for a pawn storm or to support a knight jump to g3, while also limiting black's kingside pawn expansion and potentially opening lines for white's rook. The bishop retreats to f8, a sound decision to maintain its defense of the kingside and prepare for a potential g5 push from white. This move solidifies the kingside pawn structure, preventing black from using the f6 square for tactical threats and preparing to expand on the kingside with moves like g4 and h4. This move begins to activate the rook on d8, aiming to challenge the open d-file and potentially support a pawn advance or maneuver into more active squares as the queens are off the board. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to control the central squares and potentially attack the d6 pawn after further pawn advances. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control the important c3 square and potentially prepare for a kingside pawn advance or support a central break. This move aims to consolidate the rook on a more active file, potentially preparing for future advances on the kingside or supporting a central pawn push. The bishop's return to h6 aims to recapture the bishop if white plays nb3, while also eyeing potential opportunities on the h4-d8 diagonal if the e-file opens further. The pawn push f4 aims to gain space on the kingside, challenge black's central pawn structure, and potentially open lines for white's pieces, particularly the rooks. The bishop retreats to a more passive square, indicating a lack of immediate attacking prospects and a desire to maintain its defensive presence. against potential pawn breaks on the kingside. This move signals an intention to regroup the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside advance or preparing for a maneuver to the queenside. The knight's repositioning to d6 aims to control the central e4 and c4 squares, potentially preparing for a pawn push or supporting pieces on the queenside. The rook's repositioning to the e1 square continues white's strategy to control the central e-file, aiming to create attacking opportunities and support potential pawn advances later in the game. This move prepares to challenge white's kingside pawn push, aiming to prevent the creation of a passed pawn on the h-file and potentially opening a path for black's king to the center. The rook on f1 repositions to the f-file, preparing to challenge black's control and potentially support an advance of the f-pawn or reinforce the king's position. This move prepares to challenge white's control of the b-file and potentially open lines for the rook to participate in the kingside attack or defend the central pawns. The rook on a1 activates on the queenside, preparing to potentially challenge black's queenside pawn structure or offer support to white's own advancing pawns. This move repositions the rook to the e-file, aiming to control the open file and potentially support a kingside advance, while also preparing to challenge white's rook on e1. The move re1 repositions the rook to an open file, aiming to increase its influence and potentially prepare for a future advance on the kingside or control of the center. The black rook on b8 is strategically repositioned to support a potential advance on the b-file, aiming to disrupt white's queenside space advantage and prepare for future pawn breaks or exchanges. This move begins the process of opening up the kingside, aiming to create attacking chances by preparing for f5 and potentially a pawn storm, while also freeing the f1 rook. This pawn capture resolves the central tension and opens lines for the rooks, creating dynamic play. This recapture is critical as it opens lines for your knight to potentially penetrate the queenside or control central squares, while also solidifying your pawn structure after black's exchange. The move nb5 aims to challenge white's control of the d7 pawn and potentially create tactical threats on the queenside, while also preparing to redeploy the knight to a more active square if white's structure allows. The knight repositions to c3 to prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside or to support a future central push, aiming to improve piece coordination after the recent exchanges. This exchange of rooks is strategically sound, simplifying the position and preventing white's knight from utilizing the strong c5 outpost effectively after further maneuvering. This move recaptures the pawn on e4, re-establishing material equality and preparing to mobilize the rook on the open e-file for potential central influence or infiltration. Black recaptures the knight, simplifying the position and accepting a potentially weaker pawn structure on the kingside after white recaptures on c5. This move creates an immediate doubled pawn on the c-file, which can become a strategic weakness if black can target it, but it also secures the d4 pawn and opens lines for white's rook on the c-file. This move aims to reactivate the rook on the d-file, potentially contesting the open file and preparing to support a kingside pawn advance or create pressure on white's central pawns. This move exchanges a knight for a bishop, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit the open c-file after black recaptures, potentially creating advantages in the endgame. This move is a strategic concession of the pawn on the queenside to achieve a more active position for the knight, which can now potentially control key central squares or even prepare to advance. This move initiates a pawn break to exploit the slightly weakened kingside pawn structure and open Lines for potential piece activity. The capture of the pawn is necessary to prevent white's f5 pawn from becoming a dangerous passed pawn into open lines for counterplay on the kingside. This pawn capture opens the g-file, potentially activating white's rook and creating attacking chances against black's king, while simultaneously improving white's pawn structure. This move aims to activate the rook on the g-file, potentially creating threats against white's king or supporting a pawn push on the kingside. This move aims to centralize the king, preparing to actively participate in the endgame by supporting the queenside pawns and potentially contesting the open files. This rook move aims to bring the piece back into the game, supporting the d-pawn and preparing for potential exchanges or counterplay on the kingside. This move repositions the rook to the second rank, potentially supporting pawn advances or preparing to contest the d-file if black's rook moves. This move aims to activate the rook on the central file and create a strong attacking force with the other rook, potentially pressuring white's kingside or creating mating threats. Moving the king to b4 aims to activate it in the endgame, preparing to support the passed b-pawn and potentially attack black's queenside pawns. The move seeks to centralize the king for better defense and coordination with the remaining pieces, aiming to weather white's potential pawn advances on the kingside while looking for counterplay opportunities. The advanced passed pawn on a6 gains crucial space on the queenside, threatening to promote and forcing black to dedicate resources to its containment. The capture creates a passed pawn on the a-file for white, but it also opens the b-file for black's rook and potentially frees black's kingside pawns. This move initiates a dangerous pawn race down the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn that could threaten black's king. The rook on e4 is now vulnerable to capture by the white king after the pawn advances on the queenside. This move repositions the king to a more active central square, preparing to support the a-pawn's advance while keeping an eye on potential breakthroughs. This pawn break aims to open lines and create dynamic play, forcing white to decide between capturing and allowing a passed pawn or retreating and facing increased pressure on the queenside. The move d5 aims to challenge black's central pawn and potentially open lines for white's pieces, creating dynamic possibilities in a complex endgame situation. This move opens the c-file, creating an immediate tactical challenge for white to defend against potential pressure on their king and pawn structure. This move forces black's king to an awkward square, potentially leading to further material gains or a decisive positional advantage for white due to the exposed king and white's superior pawn structure on the queenside. White has just forced a passed pawn on d5 with the sacrifice of their rook for the bishop, and black's king now faces immense pressure from the advanced white pieces and the dangerous d-pawn. The rook on d3 is crucial for defending the pawn on d5 and supporting potential king-side activity, or a later advance of the c-pawn. This move aims to create an active passed pawn on the queenside by advancing the a-pawn, which could become a significant threat if white cannot effectively blockade or capture it. This rook sacrifice aims to activate the g-file and create counterplay against black's king, capitalizing on the exposed position after black's pawn push. This pawn push creates a passed pawn, aiming to disrupt white's defenses and potentially open lines for black's pieces. The white king boldly advances to c6, aiming to participate actively in the endgame and contest the d5 pawn. The move aims to activate the king to support the potential passed pawn on b3 and contest the open b-file, creating dynamic counterplay against white's well-placed king. This winning move seizes the b-pawn, creating an unstoppable passed pawn on the queenside and forcing black to concede material to prevent its promotion. The king's crucial centralizing journey continues, aiming to support the queenside pawns and prepare for potential king activity or defense on the open b-file. This checking move forces the black king to a more vulnerable square, allowing white to consolidate their material advantage and potentially advance their passed pawn. The king abandons its safe square and ventures into the dangerous open terrain, a desperate attempt to support the weak b-pawn and potentially threaten the white king. This move delivers a critical discovered check, forcing black's king into a more vulnerable position and allowing white to exploit the open b-file. For further pressure, black's king is now under immense pressure, as white's rook controls the critical b6 square and aims to penetrate further into black's position. The king's repositioning to kb5 activates a critical endgame principle, aiming to support the advanced b-pawn and control the crucial b-file for an eventual breakthrough. This pawn push aims to create a passed pawn on the b-file, a critical element in endgame play where the remaining pieces cannot stop it from promoting. This rook sacrifice aims to break through the opponent's pawn shield, creating a dangerous passed pawn and potentially opening lines for the king to deliver a decisive attack. This move activates the rook to contest the open file, creating counterplay by threatening to attack white's king and potentially create mating threats or force material concessions. With the opponent's king exposed and the pawns on the kingside now vulnerable, capturing this pawn decisively ends the tactical skirmish, simplifying into a winning endgame. This rook pawn push aims to create a passed pawn, but it allows black to promote their own pawn with decisive force. This move delivers a decisive check, forcing the black king to a worse square and paving the way for the rook to penetrate and create further threats. The move sacrifices the rook on the a-file to force a favorable endgame where white's king can advance to support the passed pawn, securing victory. This endgame is fundamentally determined by white's passed a-pawn, which, after trading off black's defensive potential on the third rank, can now advance to promotion with decisive effect. This move recaptures a pawn, aiming to untangle white's material advantage and create potential counterplay in the endgame. The rook's return to g3 prepares to potentially support the advance of the passed pawn on the g-file and reinforce the kingside, while also maintaining pressure on black's slightly exposed king. The rook retreats to f6, defending the passed pawn on b3 and preparing to potentially support a counterattack or defend key squares. This move initiates a decisive checkmate sequence by forcing the black king into a vulnerable corner, leading to an inevitable king hunt. The rook on g8 is now actively supporting the advance of the a-pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn with the king in a more central and secure position. This check forces the black king to the edge of the board, simplifying the position and preparing to attack the king's shelter. 70. kc8. The king is drawn to the center to support the rook and potentially create counterplay, but it exposes itself to further checks from white's rook. The rook advances to the 7th rank, creating an immediate threat of checkmate on h8 and forcing black to defend with their king, thereby centralizing the opposing king and preparing a further attack.